Good afternoon. It's good to be with you today, those of you here in the chapel, and those of you online and in our overflow space. Would you take a moment to pray with me? Gracious God, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm going to tell you something about myself. I'm a Star Wars fan. It's my favorite science fiction movie series. I love the characters, the creatures, the droids, the planets and the systems, the fact that Jedi are both men and women. I love the classic battle between good and evil and the use of the Force. I mean, I could quote you the way Obi-Wan talks about the Force to Luke Skywalker, but I will spare you that. But you know what? My good friend and former boss, Myron, hates Star Wars. He just doesn't get science fiction. It's not real, he says. As children, we are encouraged to use our imaginations. It fosters cognitive and social skills. It allows space for practice and to work out fears. Imagination encourages creativity and empathy. But I suppose somewhere along the way, imagining is deemed less important. And as adults, most of us spend less time working on that muscle. But when I read Exodus, it can seem like science fiction to me. We have a bush that burns and is not consumed, a staff that shift shapes into a snake and has the power to part a body of water. And what about the plagues? Water turning to blood, frogs, gnats, flies everywhere, just to name a few. And just last week, the lectionary text that Reverend Hall used told us about water coming from a rock. Can you imagine? Our text for today comes after God has led the chosen people of Israel out of slavery, and they have arrived at Mount Sinai. Chapter 19 describes Moses going up the mountain to receive instruction from God on how to prepare the people for the Lord to come to Moses in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when God speaks to Moses and so trust Moses ever after. The people are consecrated and are prepared for an encounter with God in order to enter into covenant with God. God has promised that if the people obey God's voice and keep God's holy covenant, that they will be for God a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. So Moses has gathered the people as instructed, and they are afraid. Can you imagine the scene? The text tells us God is speaking these words. We call them commandments, but that's not the word used here. God speaks words, just words. Commandments, sayings, matters, policy statements, however you want to term them, it is clear they are relational. The people are with Moses and Aaron and God as the words are pronounced, and the relationship is clear from the get-go. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. There is a history here. There is an ongoing relationship. The first set of commandments focus on this relationship between God and the people. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an idol. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. God speaks these words to God's people, and it is clear. We are in this together. I am yours, and you are mine. There is loyalty, a covenant, a commitment. The next commandment serves as a bridge between the first three and the remaining six. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The dean, who told me she was going to join us online today, reminds us to drink water and rest regularly, right? This is what we're talking about. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Even God rested on the seventh day after creation. Why is this one so hard? One commentary suggested that keeping the Sabbath is a way to uphold equality. Every human, every animal, everything rests. It's a day of well-being where all enjoy rest without distinction. It is a day where all of creation can be renewed. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Disengage from the world. Disengage from fixation on productivity and purchasing, from the power systems that divide and suppress. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The remaining commandments focus on the community, how the people of God are to treat one another. They are terse and simple prohibitions. While they may be a list of rules for an individual to follow, they are meant for community. To fully understand them, to get them right, the people have to understand that they are bound by their relationship with the God of the Exodus. These commandments are more than a set of moral ideas. They are rooted in God's own life and ordering of the world, in God's relationship with the chosen people of Israel. Once the people are right with God and have taken a day to reset themselves, they can begin to be right with their neighbor. Honor your father and mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. These commandments are so terse and yet so rich. Each one, in its own way, points to a vision of community where all are treated fairly, where relationships are not distorted but are beneficial and true, where wrong can be named and righted, where justice and fairness rule the day. They point to a future where the next generations know the stories of the God of the Exodus and live in the land that God has provided. They point to a future that is not stolen from people or communities by the power structure. They imagine liberation. God speaks these words to God's people. It is in their relationship one with another that the community can thrive. How one conceives of God impacts how one relates to the community. These words, spoken by God to God's people, are a call to protest against exploitative relationships of all kinds. It is the worship of the God of the Exodus that demands the people to imagine relationships in whole, healing, and liberating ways. If this isn't a word for a world in a pandemic, in the dumpster fire that is 2020, I don't know what is. Just listening to Morning Edition or scrolling through my Twitter feed sets me on edge. When I see a notification from the New York Times pop up on my lock screen, I think twice before I read it. And even my book club has me reading Mark O'Connell's Notes from an Apocalypse. I can't catch a break. As ones who call ourselves people of God, what is our response? Can we imagine a new way? A few weeks ago, Professor Brooks stated something like, no one likes a political sermon, something like that. But this text in these times points me in that direction. These are my opinions. You may see things differently. This text begins with God reminding the people that God brought them out of the house of slavery. Yet these United States were founded on the institution of slavery and embraced the violence inherent in that system. Racial injustice persists, and we must bear witness to mass incarceration, income inequality, unequal access to health care and education. The text says, "You shall not steal," but we witness futures stolen through redlining and Jim Crow. The text says, "You shall not murder," but we say their names. Wildfires in the West and hurricanes in the South show how we've neglected to care for the planet, for the land given by God. As climate change and economic oppression lead to migration, borders, separation, and legislation that deem the immigrant as other plague us. Under our present leadership, the US is becoming more insular, distrusting institutions where the world leaders could work together, pulling out of treaties and pacts. It sows disinformation, it foments fear and hatred, and it undermines institutions like the CDC and the FDA. And it is using sheer political power to tip the scales of justice. Unemployment is devastating families, and more than 200,000 Americans have died of COVID-19. And over 1 million people in the world have died to this virus. So can we see a new way? Do we possess that kind of imagination? How do we imagine a liberated community? How do we enact these words of God's imagination for a new society, a priestly kingdom, a holy nation? God knows the world needs it. We see where these commandments are not followed on a daily basis through systems that have long kept power for the few at the expense of many. Now is the time for the common good and covenant, not individualism. Now is the time for protest and imagination. When I was in seminary, I had a friend named Kathleen. And Kathleen and her husband had served as missionaries before she decided to pursue an MDiv. And they had 2 boys, elementary school aged. And the younger one was constantly being reprimanded by his teacher for giving away his pencil or piece of paper to a classmate who needed it, leaving himself unable to have the tools he needed for the day. And Kathleen just refused to correct her son on this, saying, "How can I teach him not to help someone who needs it?" Can you imagine? Friends, we are fortunate to be part of an institution that has a history of working towards racial justice. And if you attended the virtual town hall earlier this month, you know all about that. This institution also lives into commitments to ecological justice and gender inclusivity. We mean it when we say all means all. I give thanks to be part of this institution, which continues to challenge and to work and to educate and to nurture. So, let's continue the work together. There's plenty of it to go around. Let's protest. Let's change laws. Let's speak when we see injustice. Call our legislators. Let's call and write postcards to voters. And let's vote. The vision of a liberated world comes from an understanding that God is a God of abundance, not scarcity. The liberated world is one in which no one goes it alone, but each has a role to play to bring the vision to fruition. In our text today, God speaks words to God's people. God speaks God's laws for living into a liberated community far from the bonds of slavery. In the 10 Commandments, the people are called to know and be in relationship with God, to take time to keep the Sabbath, and be in right relationship with neighbor. Today's text ends with thunder and lightning, with Moses telling the people to not be afraid. People are at a distance while Moses draws near to the thick darkness where God was. I take a little comfort in that. Surely God is in the thick darkness that we witness. These words God speaks to God's people come in the wilderness, after all. May we hear the words anew. May we find ways to be loyal to God, to keep the Sabbath, and care for one another. May we use our imaginations to create a better way.